The creditworthiness of the United States has been downgraded again. How will that impact the economy and Trump's tariff strategy? Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. The United States federal debt is now much larger than its GDP, meaning the country owes more than it produces in a year. Moody's ratings agency was the third and last to downgrade the U.S. debt rating, citing a rising budget deficit. Meanwhile, the trade dispute is also putting pressure on American retailers. CGTN's Owen Fairclough takes a look at where we stand on tariffs.
Walmart is the biggest grocery store chain in the United States that aims for the smallest prices, but not for much longer, it seems. The company has told its customers, prepare for higher prices, because it says it cannot absorb the impact of tariffs on imports on goods into the United States. And that's despite the fact that the Trump administration that imposed those tariffs has pared back the steepest on trade partners such as China. It seems for Walmart customers, the damage has already been done.
It's really terrible. I am retired, so I'm on a steady income, but I'm just saying, like, it's just crazy. It's just like, you know, I mean, what do you eat?
How much are you thinking about all these duties and the cost of living going up?
They need to get rid of that man. He's crazy.
And Trump reacted swiftly to that announcement by Walmart, posting on his Truth Social network, Walmart made billions of dollars last year, far more than expected. Between Walmart and China, they should eat the tariffs. Now, it's true that Walmart did enjoy pretty healthy earnings in the first quarter of this year, but the company says the cost of things like car seats are now likely to go up by a third, and it can't help but to pass those costs along to the consumer. And all of this amid a huge patchwork of tariffs that were announced by Trump in his so-called Liberation Day in early April. Since then, some of those tariffs have been scaled back. So here's a quick recap of where things stand. There's a 10% universal tariff on pretty much every import into the United States from around the world, and up to 30% on imports from Canada, China and Mexico. The steepest tariffs on China have been pared back until August, and some goods have been excluded: smartphones, computers and vehicle parts. And China and the US do plan to meet again after talks in Switzerland earlier this month yielded that bilateral agreement for each side to pare back the steepest tariffs on each other's imports. But time is of the essence. Retailers like Walmart are escalating fears that Trump's trade war is going to end in both a recession and a return to inflation, which took years to tame. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
To discuss the tariffs and the U.S. debt downgrade, let's bring in our panel. From Portland, Oregon, Liang is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. From Beijing, Qiang is assistant director of the International Monetary Institute. Here in our studio, we're joined by Sourabh Gupta. He is senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. And Anton Fedyashin is a history professor at American University. Welcome to all of you. Liang, let's start with the Moody's downgrade. This was a credit downgrade of the U.S. government's sovereign credit. Moody's was the last of the three agencies, as I said, to downgrade credit. What impact is this going to have on the United States and globally?
Yeah, good to be with you, Anand. Well, so let's talk about this first of all. You know, we need to take what Moody said with a grain of salt. We know that, you know, for example, these great rating agencies have really rated a lot of these very problematic CDOs and structured mortgage-backed securities back in the great financial crises as AAA, right? So I think there's a lot of problems with their ratings, and not to mention, Moody also downgraded Japan's rating back in 1998 when Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio was 70% at that time. And that basically didn't prevent Japan from continuing to grow its public debt to today, you know, over $236 percent of GDP, debt to GDP ratio. Now, but that said, I do think that this downgrade basically shows that the U.S.'s debt is rising, and with the rising interest rate, especially interest rate payments on the treasuries, on these assets balance, reserve balances, what this means is that all this interest payments inject a lot of money into the U.S. economy in the private sector, especially for the bondholders and other banks that hold those assets reserves. And so this is really a very negative, regressive wealth transfer, from the public budgets to these bondholders, these very wealthy individuals. Not to mention, we know right now the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill is being discussed at the House, and a lot of it comes with a lot of tax benefits that would go to the rich, the top income earners, with some spending cuts that would affect Medicaid programs and so on and so forth, according to the Tax Foundation. Again, a lot of these tax benefits would only enrich certain groups of corporations and large, wealthy individuals. And yet we're seeing low-income families, they're not getting much of this tax benefits, but they're facing the burden of these rising, tariff rate. As the reporter talked about, Walmart is likely to see price increases, and this would definitely hurt these lower income families. So I think overall, it's not a matter of insolvency. The U.S.'s, government is spending dollars and incur debt in the dollars that they always have the means to pay for, right? They will not run out of dollar bills. And yet I think the problems are really consequential when it comes to distributional impact, and also in terms of the really needs of the economy, where the people are going to bear the burden of these tax payments and also the interest payments.
Yeah, Yang Liang, you say we have to take this ratings downgrade with a grain of salt, but it's also about sentiment, isn't it? About business confidence.
Absolutely. I think we already see tremendous amount of uncertainty in the U.S. economy, with the tariff war now at the pause, but then the next thing is this big, very controversial, tax cut bill. I think the uncertainty is very prevailing, and I think that definitely hurts the business sentiment. Not to mention, of course, as I just mentioned, with the downgrade, yes, the bond market is going to look for higher yield on these treasuries, and so there will be even more bond interest payments to the rich individuals, and yet the threat is the cut of some of the essential public programs, and again, hurt the lower income families the most.
Okay. Anton, great to have you with us in the studio. Anton, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, he downplayed this ratings downgrade, saying it was lagging behind. It was a lagging indicator, he called it, looking at the past and not at the future. But the founder of one of America's biggest investment firms, Ray Dalio, posted on X that the rating is actually understating the risk, and that risks for U.S. government debt are greater than the ratings agencies are conveying. There was even a hashtag that said, "How countries go broke." How serious is this?
Well, I think in the long term, it is very serious for the United States, mostly in terms of public confidence and international confidence in the American financial system. Listen, most of the people who are watching this show right now have lived through one financial crisis in living memory, and that was 2008, 2009, and 2010, which started here in the United States because of the way the banks have mismanaged the mortgages issue. This will be even worse than that if the United States really gets into a hole that it can barely dig itself out of. And for me as an historian, the most important aspect of this are the long-term implications, because we are very much still living in the financial world that was created by the United States, by the Bretton Woods system, from which, by the way, the U.S. itself withdrew, but the basic structure is still there. Donald Trump is pursuing, as often happens with him, two policies that don't seem to mesh with each other. On the one hand, there is the trade war, which he hopes will revitalize the American economy. On the other hand, he expects, and he's made multiple public announcements about his expectation that the dollar will remain the reserve currency of the world. But that's becoming increasingly difficult for the United States to maintain as countries choose regional, economic, and geopolitical alliances over being full members of a Western system where the hegemon, the ruling country, the country that is still systemically dominant, that being the US, is making decisions that affect everyone else, even in a more serious fashion than it is the American people themselves. Although I think we'll hear those voices in 2026 when the midterm elections come around. So it's all chaos, and we started with Bessent. He's the one who used the term during an interview just a couple of weeks ago of strategic uncertainty, and I think the Trump administration hopes that it can muddy the water and pull out some benefits for the United States, but that's an open question about how long they can keep up this juggling act.
Okay, Qiang, China is one of the biggest foreign holders of US Treasury bonds, so how will this be looked at from China?
Well, Anton, you have to understand, international payment of balance is actually a very simple equation. Basically, in China, we have lots of the trade surpluses against America, but that happened with a current account, which means China sells lots of the services and products and t-shirts, toys, and the things to America, and then we get the U.S. dollar flow back to China. And then with the U.S. dollar position in China's hand, what should we do with that? Well, normally we need to try to buy some assets to get some interest rate so that they wouldn't depreciate. That's the reason why we, previously we tried to buy lots of the T-bond or U.S. assets, United States stock shares, and that will cause a trade deficit financially or in the financial or capital account against the United States. So this is actually a very balanced circle. It's a flow in and flow back. So actually, America, when they accusing that China has a lot of trade surplus against America, but also China's had a lot of the trade or financial deficit against America because we're buying a lot of the T-bond. Right now, with Trump's tariff war, the whole situation has been changed. For example, right now, the Chinese trade surplus against America in the current account has been reduced dramatically. So that will cause a lot of the financial position in China's hand will be also been reduced. We will have less U.S. dollar to buy T-bond, buy U.S. stock, stock shares. Currently, that will cause a major rise in the T-bond price and a fall, T-bond rates, and also the major fall in T-bond price. Currently, if you take a look at 30-year T-bond in the United States, well, the peak has already been touching 5%. So this is going to be really, really bad because we always see 4.5% is probably a very dangerous level, but now it's been touching 5%. So I think if this imbalance has been continuing not only against China, but also against many other nations, they will cripple U.S. financial system itself and also, making American, national credit into a very, very terrible situation. So I think we're going to continue to see how this is going to evolve. And I think, all the three credit raters, they have a very solid reason to downgrade America further in the future.
Sourabh, good to have you in the studio as well. When Moody's made this announcement, it blamed the downgrade on the United States' $36 trillion debt, ballooning debt, and with little or no government action to address that. What impact will this have on the global economy and on investment into the United States?
One of the effects of the Moody's announcement is that, at least in the short term, interest rates will have gone up, or yes, not interest rates, but in the market is higher, demanding higher yield. And of course, this hurts both the United States, but it also could hurt developing countries. We have to understand that the developing countries coming out of COVID, they came into a serious debt distress situation. I'm talking about the poorest countries. Yeah. Serious debt distress situation, but that arose primarily because of the Federal Reserve's mismanagement of the interest rate cycle. They were too late, too slow, and then they had to jump up rapidly in terms of interest rates. And those interest rates then effectively became interest rates were added on into the economies of these other countries, because money was moving out into the U.S. because the interest rates were so high, and so they had difficulty refinancing their debt, etc. Now, think about it that Mr. Trump comes up with this massive tax cut, as you know, as was talked about, there are real distributional consequences out here because the poor people are going to see their prices go up. But meantime, there's going to be the huge tax cut. Benefit, of course, will go to the rich. But the more important point is that itself will expand the deficit. Markets will demand higher interest rates on that. So if we notice that this kind of market rates go up and up and up, that is going to have an impact on developing countries also, because the interest rate for the U.S. in the U.S. also is a kind of a proxy for the interest rate for global economies. So that's more or less, I would say, not good news.
Yang Liang, how serious is the risk or the danger of the United States defaulting on its debt? Because in a sense, and this is where I'm going to have to tap into your expert financial knowledge, in a sense, it is debt, but it's debt that it owes itself, doesn't it? And, you know, as Anton was pointing out a moment ago, the dollar is still the dominant reserve currency in the world. It's used for trade throughout the world. I mean, that is changing, but it still is the main currency.
Yeah, precisely. Again, because these U.S. public debt is denominated in the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. government can always pay its bills. In other words, the U.S. government is not going to sort of run out the dollars to pay for its bill. Any decision to default is going to be a political one, and we know that you know the risk is real because with these bipartisan disputes, there is a real danger that if the Congress does not lift the debt ceiling, we know the so-called X day is in August this year. If there's any political fallout, then there is a danger that the U.S. will voluntarily, I wanted to emphasize that, to default on its own debt, not because it cannot come up with the money to pay for its bill, but rather is because of the defunct political system that does not allow this monetary system to function effectively. Now, I also wanted to just add to the point where, these kinds of credit downgrading and the U.S.'s so-called mismanagement of debt is really based on, again, the distributional problems, but also really the lack of strategic priority when it comes to how to utilize the public money for public costs. Trump's administration always blame on the Biden administration, which is very ridiculous, right? You're already 3 months into the office. You already done so many executive orders, and it's attention that you don't try to get your fiscal sort of priorities straight. Basically, the forecast is that with the tax bill that Trump is coming up with, it's going to add the federal deficit from last year's 6.4% of GDP to 9% by 2035. And largely is because, again, there's large interest payment on debt, which is going to be the second largest, fiscal spending outside of entitlement spending. It's even more than military budget. So you can see this is very large interest payment, by the federal government is going to squeeze on other spending that are much more necessary. For example, the Trump administration has been cutting, many of the essential public services, including, Department of Education, also National Sciences Foundation, 55% of budget cuts proposed, and the National Institute of Health, 44% of the proposed budget cuts. So all of this, I think, will not only, create a lot of chaos and really disrupt the public services in the short term, but also have long-term consequences and undermine the U.S. long-term prospect of innovation, education, research and development, and so on and so forth.
Anton, very briefly, one of the questions we often hear, one of the questions I often pose as well is, if the United States is in the hole for $36 trillion, how come it can afford to give the Pentagon $1 trillion every year and then maintain, 800 bases around the world?
Well, because as long as the dollar is being used by a sufficient amount of countries around the world, the U.S. can print more of them. And that's a political decision, as is the defense budget. By the way, the Trump administration is not showing any willingness to cut that. It's cutting, as Yang just spoke about, everything else. But it's the defense and the immigration, the border protection budget that is, both of them are planning to be increased. We'll see how that works out.
Okay, Sourabh, I want to turn to tariffs. Many of the tariffs imposed on so-called Liberation Day have been scaled back. But we look at the stock market, it's still on this roller coaster. One day it's going up, the other day it's going down. I mean, is there still a great deal of uncertainty on these tariffs? I mean, in the next few weeks or next few months, are we going to see even further lowering of the tariffs?
Oh, I think there's tremendous uncertainty. Even if you ask the experts, you don't know where it's going to land at the end of the day. Different countries, different rates, different regions, different sectors. It's just not possible to say where to go. I mean, even with China, I mean, go back to the previous Trump administration, they did have agreements which then were not implemented. Let me frame it this way. They had agreements in principle, but which they were not able to put into effect, and then which were rescinded.
Right.
And ultimately, in the last year, you had that phase 1 agreement, which they then decided to do. But there were 2 false starts before that. So even if we do have an agreement or some sort of an agreement, it doesn't mean it's going to be something final and binding.
Yeah.
So that creates a lot of uncertainty in markets. I think at this point of time, financial markets have been able to factor some of that in.
Right.
The bond market has disciplined the Trump administration, and Scott Bessent is looking very closely at movements in bond yields.
Yeah.
So there is a disciplining factor out here. Consumer confidence is already down, and this can have implications for the economy, which makes harder for Fed Chairman Powell, because he doesn't know the direction of interest rate cuts, even of interest rate movements,
right.
whether because of these tariffs, the economy slumps, so he needs to cut.
And he's
tariffs.
under political pressure from the White House.
And he's under political pressure, and meantime, markets are saying yields are going up, you need to take, so it's a very uncertain environment.
Anton, speaking of Scott Bessent, this is what he had to say on tariffs. Let's listen.
President Trump has put them on notice that if you do not negotiate in good faith, that you will ratchet back up to your April 2nd level.
So, lots of bluster there, lots of bravado. I mean, but do the actions of the administration bear that out?
Well, so far they're bearing out the fact that the administration wants to split the herd, so to speak, and to target countries as individuals. As we saw with the British example, it actually works with nations that are more dependent on the United States, that have, for example, like Britain, left the EU, lost the protection that the bloc gave it in terms of trade negotiation status, and now they first singled themselves out, and now they became a victim. This is going to work much less against countries that are as populous and powerful economically as China and India, as Russia is. Geopolitically, certainly. The Trump administration's policies are the best gift to organizations such as the BRICS than anyone in the BRICS could have possibly expected. And so the next time they'll meet in Brazil, which is this year, Brazil is hosting the next meetings, it will be very interesting to watch what the theme will be, what the panels will be, and how much attention will be paid to tariffs and international trade policies.
Qiang, the United States and China met for those tariff negotiations, and they negotiated a 90-day pause. But if we look at China's industrial production over in April, it expanded 6.1% year on year, that is, and the economy grew by 5.4% in the first quarter. That actually exceeded expectations. So China was prepared for this, wasn't it?
Yes, China is fully prepared. I think we have one thing in common among all the walks of life in China, that Chinese economy is very resilient, that's for sure. If you take a look at the GDP numbers that you just mentioned, 5.1% of growth. And I think the upgrading of the whole industry structures is going on very well. Basically, if you take a look at the high-end industry, like the semiconductors, like green energy, like EV, and also digital devices, has been growing at double digits. Consumption is also going on pretty well, not going beyond the expectation of 5%, 5.1%. We're actually looking for more, like 6 or 7%, but still doing very okay. Tourism is good. Visa-free policy has been working out, and also domestic traveling has been, booming, on fire. So I think domestic, circle, because we're talking about the dual circulation in China. On one hand, we have to focus on international market, diversify our partners, not only America, but also global assassination, but also domestically, we try to, put more strength in our economy. And I think the whole, planning has been working out recently. But we do worry about after 90 days because according to all the signs, after 90 days, this is not going to be turned out. So China right now has been working even harder in today, and also I think in a day after today, we're going to still have another, government press conference talking about how we're going to do more in the policy packages, and we're going to see more in June and also in July. That's for sure. And also, on contrary, if you take a look at the Balkan, dry goods indexes or other shipment indexes, you will find out that all the ocean shipment indexes have been soaring up very quickly. It shows that the whole market, not only China, is not very confident about China and the U.S. talk, after 90 days. So everybody's trying to hoard the product before this 90-day deadline. So Chinese government fully understand that, and we are getting prepared for that as well.
Okay. Liang, Donald Trump repeatedly, often tells Americans that it's the Chinese who are going to pay for these tariffs. And that, of course, is not the case. And we had no more a graphic example of that this past weekend when Walmart, the big, huge retailer, the biggest in the country, warned that prices will be going up. And Donald Trump told them, well, you should, as our reporter told us, eat the tariffs. Yeah, he wants Walmart to take the hit for that. So how does a company like Walmart respond to an ultimatum like that?
Well, I don't think the Walmart can really eat the tariffs, as they say, right? These corporations, they have the quarterly, stock report that they need to turn out to their investors. And so I think it's also very ironic that, this is a so-called free market economy where the government is interfering and directly telling these corporations how to do the pricing. Not to mention, I think you talked about earlier in terms of the lack of good faith, according to Besant. But I think when it comes to U.S.-China negotiations, it seems to me at this point is the U.S. is not having the good faith. When you think about how they double down on, the so-called strategic decoupling and trying to circle China and cut the assets of China to the U.S.'s, AI chips. They're now, rolling back some of the so-called AI diffusion rule by the Biden administration, but they do, warn the rest of the world of using the Chinese AI chips and also using, the Chinese AI chips in the U.S. AI models. And so I think that is a very blunt threat. And, I think that is really the problem, as the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson has talked about, this is unacceptable. This is not going to set a good stage for the negotiations. And at the same time, I also wanted to say that, as you mentioned earlier, in April, China's export number actually, did very well. Dollar amount is gone up by over 8%. So I think, in this sort of tariff negotiations, I do think that China has a strong position entering into these negotiations. And I do think that China has a lot of room to cooperate on the fentanyl issues, and China has the willingness to do so. So hopefully the U.S. will not derail the kind of the negotiation, but pursuing this very, I would say, coercive policy on AI and semiconductor chips.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington.